And Chris Pirtle of NBA Insiders joins us here on The Last Word on Sports on SB Nation Radio. Chris, welcome back. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, Brandon, doing good. How about yourself?
Wonderful, thank you. Obviously, a very busy time for you with all these flurry of moves going on, as is the norm with NBA free agency. So we'll start right off the bat with the Chris Paul trade. What does it mean for the Rockets? And with James Harden having essentially what amounts to a career year at point guard this season, why go after Chris Paul?
Well, Brandon, I must admit that's probably one of the first questions I asked myself when I got news of the trade. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized, we just saw one of the most talented teams, possibly the most talented team in the history of the NBA, go 16-1 in the playoffs and win an NBA championship. And one of the things that made the Golden State Warriors the talented team that they are is their ability to pass the ball. Possibly the best passing team I've ever seen in the history of the NBA. So I don't think you can ever have enough good passers on your team. So the more I thought about this deal for the Rockets, the more I liked it in terms of being able to pass the ball. We know they have good shooters. I imagine they're going to add even better shooters as we move on in free agency. So I think it's a great deal for the Rockets, and I think it definitely improves their team.
And on the other side, the Clippers are acquiring a lot of young talent, especially on the defensive side of the ball. What impact, if any, will the guys that the Clippers received from the Rockets have this season and going forward?
Well, I tell you, Brendan, I must admit I'm not nearly as optimistic for the Clippers for this trade, and I'm sure most people aren't. I mean,
right.
we could try to sugarcoat this thing, but the reality of the situation is they got back Patrick Beverley, Lou Williams, Sam Decker, and those are just the guys that we've actually heard of.
Right.
So, unfortunately, the impact's not going to be that huge for Houston. For the Clippers. For whatever reason, they decided to acquire these players instead of letting Chris Paul walk, and sometimes I think maybe it would have just been better to have the cap space, but I'm sure that Jerry West and Doc Rivers have a better plan. But to answer your question, I don't think the acquisition of any of these players is really going to make a huge impact for the Clippers at all.
Absolutely. And Chris Pirtle of NBA Insiders joining us here on The Last Word on Sports on SB Nation Radio. On the Paul George front, what made Paul George so attractive to Oklahoma City, even though with this move they might be possibly looking at some cap issues here coming up in the near future?
Well, for OKC, you have to roll the dice. You're a team that has the MVP of the league, an MVP that is possibly an impending free agency next year if he decides to opt out of his contract. So you've got to do what you've got to do to bring somebody in to make this guy want to stay. And even though it's a guy that you may just be renting for a year, you have to do what you've got to do. It was about a year ago this time, Brandon, where they lost Kevin Garnett. And if you would have told this team after they lost Kevin Garnett, hey, within the next 12 months, you're going to have Paul George on your team, a guy that plays that same position, I think most Thunder fans and most executives with the Thunder would have loved that idea. So they had to roll the dice. They were obviously up against the wall, and I like the move. It obviously makes the Thunder contenders again, and it's going to be exciting to see this combination of Russell Westbrook and Paul George, no doubt about it.
Well, Chris, every trade has two sides. What should Indiana expect out of Victor Oladipo, who essentially returns home, being the star of the Indiana Hoosiers that he was, and Domantas Sabonis?
Yeah, well, funny you say that, Brandon. That's a great point because, I'm in Orlando, Florida, and every time I would watch the Magic go back to Indiana and play a game the past, well, not last year, obviously, because Oladipo wasn't here, but the previous 3 years, Oladipo has a huge following in Indiana. So the people in the Hoosier State love Oladipo. Let's remember, Victor Oladipo was the number 2 player taken in the draft just 4 years ago. So this is a guy that is approaching the prime of his career. The Thunder thought so much of him that they awarded him with a 4-year, $84 million extension right after the season began last year. So they obviously thought he was a good player. He's averaging around 17 points a game. So for the Pacers, I think this is a dream. You brought back somebody that is coming home, as you indicated, Brandon, and somebody who is into the prime of their career and somebody that's going to be under contract for the next 4 years, so they won't have to go through this free agency thing where somebody telling them that they're going to leave anytime soon because he's going to be there for a while. So I thought it was a great, unlike the Clippers-Rockets deal involving Chris Paul, I thought both teams actually came out smelling like a rose after this deal.
Absolutely. And again, we're joined by Chris Pirtle of NBA Insiders here on The Last Word on Sports on SB Nation Radio. On the free agent side of the board now, Chris, who's the first notable free agent to sign now that Blake Griffin has re-upped with the Clippers, and where will that player sign?
Well, I think the Boston Celtics are due to get somebody. So
right.
I want to say the next free agent has to sign in Boston just on default. I mean, if you're Boston and you're Danny Ainge, you didn't get Jimmy Butler, which I thought was a huge mistake. Obviously, now you're not going to get Paul George. So I would like to think, for the Celtics' sake, they're going to get somebody. And I think that somebody is going to be Gordon Hayward. There's something that tells me, Brendan, and I don't know this to be a fact, but I really think that Hayward and Brad Stevens have a bond, and I think that Hayward's going to want to go back there and play for him. But, this thing is very unpredictable, so you never know. But if I had to guess, to answer your question, I think it's going to be Gordon Hayward, and I think it's going to be Boston Celtics.
I certainly would not be surprised if that happened. I certainly wouldn't put it past them. I can talk today, I promise. Certainly wouldn't put it past Boston either. And finally, Chris, we'll let you go on this question. Steph Curry becoming the first player in NBA history to sign a $200 million deal. Will this new deal hinder the Golden State Warriors' plans long term?
No, I don't think it's going to hinder them in the grand scheme of things. They might not be able to re-sign players like Andre Iguodala, but this deal isn't going to hinder their ability to offer Kevin Durant a nice contract. Let's remember, when Kevin Durant signed with the Warriors this past offseason, he signed a 2-year deal for $54 million. Yep. However, the second year is an option, and I expect Durant to opt out of his contract. I'm actually surprised he hasn't already, but so they've saved enough money that they can re-sign Durant. You mentioned Steph Curry, and I mentioned this in the beginning of our segment, Brandon. The Golden State Warriors, the best passing team I've ever seen in the history of the NBA. Yeah. They had 2 guys in the top 12 in assists this year, Draymond Green at 9, and Steph Curry, the 12th in assists in the league this year. So I don't think it hinders their ability too much. They're going to lose some role players, but as far as keeping their core 4 together, they're going to be able to do that financially.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, as always, appreciate the insight. Thank you so much. And, of course, some more hot and heavy NBA action to come as the offseason moves along. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Brendan.
Absolutely. And, again, that was Chris Pirtle. I got Chris Paul on the brain. Chris Pirtle of NBA Insiders joining us here on The Last Word on Sports on SB Nation Radio. Well, folks, I mean, there you have it. I pretty much agree with every single thing that Chris said. I think Boston, not so much Boston should come away with somebody. I think Boston needs to come away with somebody. If Boston wants to make a statement in the NBA's Eastern Conference, because there is no doubt that with these 2 trades of Chris Paul and Paul George, that the balance of power has shifted in the NBA from the Eastern Conference to the West. Boston needs to make a move, whether it's Paul Millsap, whether it's Gordon Hayward, whether it's a sign and trade to get Carmelo Anthony. Who knows? I don't think that's going to happen in 1,000 years. But again, the Celtics have the assets, and they've got the cap space somehow miraculously. They have the cap space. Isaiah Thomas still hasn't signed his extension yet, so who knows what's going to go on with that. But I think Boston needs to come away with somebody. And again, we mentioned Paul Millsap, we mentioned Gordon Hayward. There's still a lot of different avenues that Boston can go. I know Detroit, for example, is shopping Reggie Jackson and Andre Drummond. You can go that route. You can go, who knows if Boogie Cousins is going to stay in New Orleans. Anything can happen in the NBA. If Boston does not come away with anyone, I think Boston is going to have a very hard time keeping their head above water in the Eastern Conference championship race. I do believe that Indiana and Oklahoma City, this is probably the most even trade so far out of all the trades that have occurred in the NBA so far. Again, we mentioned Victor Oladipo has a cult following. Everywhere you go in Indiana, Victor Oladipo's name comes up at least once. Anywhere you go in Orlando, you hear Victor Oladipo's name. He is a nice player. He's going to average 16 points a night. He's probably going to be the starting point guard in Indiana now. And I think him and Nate McMillan are going to have a very good relationship, which is always a good thing, because there's never been any talk that Victor Oladipo's been a bad teammate or has been, a locker room cancer or anything like that. I don't know what Domantas Sabonis is going to be, but if he's anything like his father, I think he's going to be a decent, player at best. And again, as Chris mentioned, Paul George immediately elevates Oklahoma City's status to, hey, now we got a seat at the big boy table. All right, we're not sitting at the kids' table no more. All right, now not only are we sitting at the big boy table, but we're going to eat a piece of the steak too. So it's going to be an interesting matchup come the playoffs when San Antonio and Houston and Golden State and all duke it out to see who's going to end up with the big prize. Again, I still think Golden State is still going to be the number one team coming out of the Western Conference, probably for the next 5 years. But now they have some more competition to deal with. And boy, do I love that. Coming up next, we're going to recap all the NBA trades and the winners and losers. Coming up next, you're listening to The Last Word on Sports on SB Nation Radio.